Hello, I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of Paul Orselli Workshop. Tuning in from Long Island and all the way through the magic of technology on the other side of the United States. I'm delighted to be joined by Susie Wilkening. Hi, Susie. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Paul?
Better now that you're here. So we're going to talk about your work a little bit related to data and museums, especially. But I always like to start out, if you'll indulge me, in just I think people's trajectory, like how they got to be doing what they're doing, is always interesting. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how you got to be collecting data with museums. You didn't, I don't think you started out doing that, of course.
So I went to grad school at the University of Delaware's winter program in early American culture, and I was going to be a curator at a historic house museum. I have never done that.
No,
That
that's
was my life goal. And when I left Winter, um, my first job was actually the executive director of a teeny tiny historical society in Saratoga County, New York.
no.
And I was the only full-time employee. We had a part-time educator. And because of that, and a whole slew of volunteers, I did practically everything.
Yeah. Including cleaning the toilet.
But yes, including cleaning the toilet and raking leaves and
Right.
dealing with rabid skunks on the property one member
Other
at a
other
time,
other duties as
other duties
required.
as required. And while I was doing that, and of course, the big thing was the fundraising and making sure we were making our budget every year, and I wanted to get paid. I had a lot of questions. These were really existential questions. Like, why does this place matter? Why do people care about this place? Why do
Mm,
people care about their local history?
mm,
Why do people give money to this place when the food bank feels more critical in some ways?
mm.
And just that case for support, really, and that case of why we mattered.
Why are museums necessary and not just nice?
Exactly. And looking for answers. And this was my own 1998 to 2003 is when I was there. Could not find those answers I was looking for. I moved on to my next job where I was the development director at a larger historic site, still in New York State. I was there for 3 years. Same questions. Why does this place matter? Still not finding the answers. When I left that job, I was the trailing spouse, as is not unusual among museum people. And my husband had this great job in Boston, so I went to Boston. And at that point, someone reached out to me and said, I don't have a job for you, but I have a project. And it's going to be a 6-week project. It has
Oh,
to do with museums. Can you come in and do it? And I was like, sure. And I ended up being at that research firm for 10 years. And
ah.
that's where I learned how to do the work, had ways and learning how to ask the questions
Mm.
and really push forward on starting to answer some of those questions about why we matter, which I'll get back to in a second. So, 10 years go by, ended up going off and starting my own firm in 2016, which was also right when my husband was getting recruited for a job in Seattle, trailing spouse again. Here I am now in Seattle. That's been here for 8 years. Have had my firm for 8 years. I now have employees, and we are still trying to answer that question about why museums matter.
Ah,
And what is the role? I think of the big question sometimes being, what is the role of museums in American society?
wow. That's
And it's okay that we haven't answered the question because there is no one answer. There are many, many, many answers
and many questions.
and many, many more questions. But we have a lot more insight into different ways to answer that question now than we did 20 years ago.
All right, so that's a good segue. So now here you are with your company and you are asking questions. And I know obviously you are I guess partnered, is that a good word to say, with AAM, the American Alliance of Museums, and you partner, I guess I'll use that word again, partner with lots of museums around the country who help you gather data. So talk a little bit first just about the general process, like who who are you asking exactly? I know you must ask museum members and museum people, but it seems like when I've looked at your data stories, you also ask questions of people who aren't necessarily identified as particularly museum members or even
Right.
museum goers. So talk a little bit about, first off, who you are asking these various questions of.
So when we're thinking about the public, when we're thinking about our audiences, and we go out into the field to field research, there are two main ways that we go out and do that in terms of capturing that audience sentiment. The well, I wouldn't say it's easiest. The one way we do that is where it's what's called a sample of convenience. And a sample of convenience is what we end up referring to as our frequent museum goers. These are people who are connected enough with one or more museums that they're on communications lists. They don't have to be a member, but they need to be on that communications list, that
Right.
email, maybe it's social media, but they have that connection with at least one museum that indicates a tighter relationship and
Yeah,
more frequent visitation typically.
they must like at least one museum enough
At
that
least
they've
one.
coughed up their information one
Coughed
way
up
or
info.
another.
So then what we do is, not only are they on those lists, but they receive an invitation to participate in some research. Usually it's a survey, but it can be qualitative research as well. But usually it's a survey, an invitation to take a survey, and then they take time to do so.
Okay.
And so when we field, say, the annual survey of museum goers every year, and we end up with a sample of, 100,000 people or so,
Wait,
that's those
hold
people.
on. 100,000 people connected to museums.
Yep. So these
Okay,
are
that's
members, they're on the email list,
as
or
a non-data nerd, that sounds like an awful lot of people to me.
yeah,
A
it's a
hundred
lot of people.
thousand people.
Yeah, it's a yeah, because with 100,000 responses, that ballpark, we can really slice and dice
Dig in.
data in different ways. And so, and we do that. We can go say, if we want to know what um, LGBTQ plus parents of elementary schoolers think about museum experiences, we can cut that. We have it. So I mean, we can just go really, really fine gradations, or we can just look really big picture and say, this is what's going on
So,
with museum goers.
so not to jump ahead, because I want to also find out how
Do the
you
other part.
survey not
Yeah.
people who are not directly connected, but just like the example you just gave, okay, here's LGBTQ parents and what do they think about science centers. So do some of your partner museums then they're like, we'd like to find out this piece of information, is so
Yes.
that's one way that you slice and dice the
Sure.
data.
Sure.
Cool. Well,
Yeah. I
that
mean,
will
we do get questions that are like, have you thought about looking at this filter? And we'll go like, well, let's see if it's stable. And we'll go look, and usually it is. Sometimes it's not.
So that's that not to jump ahead because we're going to talk about how people can contact you and find out about your work and participate in your work. But that seems like if I was in charge of a museum or in charge of a museum with questions like that, that seems like an added incentive to participate in your work. So that's good.
We'll come
So
back to that. Yeah.
how about
The
uh
other people.
heaven forfend, we know there are people who would not typically cross the street to visit a museum. How do you find out what they think about museums, if they even think about museums?
So when we field what we call broader population sampling, usually we call it a demographically representative sample of US adults, which by the way, we can do this in other countries too. We just we do it every year with US adults. Um, what we do is we go out and we purchase that sample. So there
Okay.
are vendors out there who have lists of people and they can put together a demographically representative sample.
Oh, cool.
And so, the main things we're looking for is we want to make sure, especially educational attainment, race and ethnicity, and age are really the main ones that we're looking at in terms of getting to that demographically representative. But they do a really good job at that now, and it's not as expensive as it used to be. And so now we just say we want a sample of 2,000 US adults is usually what we do.
Mm,
And when we put that into the field, they have no idea who's asking these questions. They don't know it's coming from me or from AAM.
right. It's just
And they don't know what the point of the survey is, which is really important because we want to use some
right.
good
You
survey
you could
signals.
be asking them about baseball or pickles or museums. Like, what do
Yeah,
you
they have no
think
idea.
about this?
And so what we do is we take the very first question of the survey and we simply make it a leisure time question.
Right.
Which of the following have you done in the past year? One of the answer choices out of like 8 or 10 lovely choices is visited a museum, including science centers. I think we say including science centers, zoos, and
Botanical gardens or
like
something
that.
like
Yeah.
that,
So
aquarium.
they know we're thinking kind of big picture.
Right, but they can, but you can see, obviously, with a broad question like that, you can see sort of where museums sort of
Where do we fall?
land up on the food chain there, near the top or near the bottom or somewhere in the middle.
Right. And we call that an indirect question because they don't know that the point of
Right.
the survey or the question even is to assess have they been in a museum in the past year?
Yeah.
So that's how we can then
Yeah,
identify.
that's super interesting though, because even aside from like where museums rank in that list of 8 or whatever it is, yeah, like if I was again a museum development person or executive director, I'd be like, whoa, lots of people are going to baseball games or Renaissance fairs or whatever, you
So
know?
we're not that specific in the answer choices, but
Uh-huh.
yes, we track sporting events, we track going to the movies,
Yeah, but even so,
things like
cool.
that. And then later in the survey, we do ask a frequency question. Now, there on the frequency question, we get a lot of what we call false positives
Hmm.
because if they know the correct answer is a lot.
Yeah.
So we don't use the question
I
for
don't
that.
want I don't
I
want
don't
to,
even look at that.
right.
There's one answer on the frequency question that we're interested in, and those are the people who are willing to say, "I don't ever visit museums."
Yeah, like
And so then what we
I
get
am
is
I am that person who would not cross the street to go to a museum
right,
even if it was free. So
yeah, or even you couldn't pay me to go to a museum.
right.
So then we can really go, these
Even
are the
worse.
people who
Even if
never
you
go.
paid me, I wouldn't go.
These are the people who never go. These are the ones who've been in the past year. And then we have these other people, which is the largest group, who are open to going to museums but haven't been in the past year. And so that's where we have those are kind of like really sporadic museum goers, and then we have our casual museum goers, and then we have our frequent museum goers that we get from the museum samples. So we can
Okay.
end up having a much more nuance and understanding of what these different segments are really like and what traits they may or may not share or have in common or how they may be dissimilar.
Well, and now we get to how after you grind up all that data meat, how you what you make out of it. And one of the cool things that you and your company produce are what you call data stories, which are sort of, I'm going to characterize them as sort of cool infographics with sort of characters in them, actually. So they
Sometimes
really
I
are
show off.
stories. They really are like stories. And so you sort of characterize some interesting tidbits and different angles that you've discovered from the data and analyzing the data. So one thing you spoke about recently or sent out information. So again, I'll say, since this ends up on YouTube, we'll make sure we put links and people can get on your email list and get their own data stories from you, and museums can join up, but we'll talk about that at the end. But one of the, I guess, data stories that you did was something that museum people think a lot about, I think, these days, like, how are we doing now post-pandemic, whatever that means, as opposed to pre-pandemic? We know what that means, at least, in terms of attendance. But what struck me in particular was that, from my point of view, you sort of said, well, wait, that's not really the whole story. That if you just say, well, we're back to pre-pandemic levels, you asked, which I thought was super interesting, like, well, what about repeat visitation, of course, which is also something. So I don't know if you could just give a couple of high
Sure.
level points related to the data that you found out about, we'll call it the post-pandemic museum attendance world, and what you also found out by digging in a little deeper to those sorts of ideas.
Sure. So we've been running the annual survey of museum goers since 2017. So we have pre-pandemic data. And we feel first quarter of the year, which meant that in 2020, we closed the survey on March 15th,
Oh,
2020.
timing is everything, isn't it?
I mean, we could not have had more fortuitous timing. If there was going to be a pandemic, I would say let's start the pandemic on March 16th.
Yeah, how
I mean,
about that?
not that we want a pandemic,
No.
but it just, the timing was amazing.
Well, we were visiting our oldest son in at the end of February in Brussels, and talk about timing. I could have ended up doing a lot of time in Brussels if things had shifted a few weeks.
I was in Brussels a few weeks ago, and not a bad place to be.
Oh yeah, no, it's very nice, but
Anyway,
yeah, so
bye-bye.
enough
So
of our travel log. What about the data, Susie?
the data. So and we had broader population sampling from before the pandemic too. So when we look at the broader population, the typical pre-pandemic percentage of the broader population that said they had set foot in a museum in the past year is around 25 to 31%.
Hmm.
So one metric we look at is what that's called incidence. It's a yes, no. Is that incidence back to where it was?
Right.
And the good news is that incidence, not only is it back, it's actually at the higher end. We were at 33% in 2024.
Okay,
So
so wait, so stop right there. So if I'm you're helping us navigate this data, and so we find out that incidents, like, have you ever
have you
gone
set
to a
foot in a museum
museum
in
in
the
the
past
past
year?
year and you get this 20 to 30%, 20, whatever it is in there, and now post-pandemic, measured by what, 2021, 2023, what?
So in 2024, when we measured, we're at 33%.
Okay, we're at the
So when we
higher end
compare
of
that to
what was.
pre-pandemic, we're actually at the higher end. So incidence is back. We're doing
Okay,
perfectly fine
so
where we were with incidence
let's take that as a positive then.
as a positive. And we
Okay,
want to grow that incidence, of course.
yeah,
It's
sure.
also interesting. This is a total sidebar. We're not going to really get into this, though there are data stories that do, is that over those years, in particular, there's been a major shift in who's going to museums and that casual
Ah.
um, is much more diverse, and it's actually pretty close to being representative of the US population of adults.
Oh, I'll take that as a positive too.
Yes. So there's some really good things that are kind of happening there. Now,
Okay.
among frequent museum goers,
Hmm.
for measuring among our frequent museum goers, they're getting more diverse too, but it's just not nearly where
Frequent defined as what?
they're coming off of those email lists. So they're the ones who are visiting more museums more frequently. They're a wider variety of museums. So they might be visiting lots of museums in the course of a year. They might be
So,
and
so
also frequency at the museum that they care about, so the one that they're on the communications list.
Okay, so those people visit multiple museums in a year, and even within those particular museums, they might visit particular museums multiple times a year.
Mhm. Yeah,
Okay.
so
Cool.
when we look at those frequent museum goers that we get from the sampling that sample convenience, well, we do ask them frequency, and their frequency data is usually more accurate than the broader population, so we do use that frequency question quite a bit. Um, and what we do is we have some questions that we ask the same way every single year, so we can track change over time.
Hmm.
So with them, what we do is we ask, how often do you visit the name of the museum that asked me to take the survey? So it could be, how often do you visit the Burke Museum of Natural History, which is here in Seattle? That might be the question, or whichever museum it is. And we track the historical data. So we have data from 2020, which is the pre-pandemic, last year pre-pandemic, because we closed March 15th,
Right?
2020. And we compare and are tracking over time the aggregate response to that question to see if people are visiting their museum as frequently now as they were before the pandemic.
Okay.
And that's where we're seeing a big gap, that people are back at visiting their museum, but not as frequently. So if they were visiting
Ah.
3 times a year before the pandemic, now maybe they're only visiting twice. Or if they were visiting 5 times a year, maybe now they're visiting 3 times.
So generally, just broadly speaking, the overall attendance numbers have hit back to pre-pandemic levels, but when you look at repeat visitation, it is actually lower than
The
pre-pandemic levels.
incidence is back to pre-pandemic, but repeat visitation is
Uh,
lower.
okay.
And people are not visiting as many different museums as they were before the pandemic. So if they were visiting 5 different museums a year, maybe now they're visiting 4. So
So
just that little those little gaps. And
that,
those little gaps add up.
yeah, that doesn't sound quite as good to me.
Not quite as good. And so when AM, we went into the field with their snapshot survey in August to see how museum attendance was doing nationally. What we found is half of museums have not yet returned to pre-pandemic attendance levels.
Overall attendance.
Hmm.
Half,
So half,
half.
half are not back where they were.
Okay, that doesn't sound so good either.
And for that half, they're averaging about 78% of their pre-pandemic attendance, which is about a 20% decrease. And so it's not that people aren't going to museums, they're just not going as much.
Yeah, well, does that carry over? Can you tell if that carries over to other things like sporting events or movies?
Nope, those things
bet
are
movies are down.
movies are definitely down. Those activities are also down. There's some I love the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Their time use survey indicates people spend about 90 more minutes at home now than they did before the pandemic.
Oh, okay.
It seems to be people are still spending more time at home. They just kind of shifted their patterns a little bit. Um, and so, but this is where psychology is so interesting. If you were to ask someone, ask a frequent museum
Are you
goer,
spending more time at home?
they would say no.
Right,
If you were asking if they were visiting museums as frequently now as before the pandemic, they would say yes,
right, but they're not.
but they're not. So the data doesn't bear it out based on how people are actually
Well,
behaving.
and that's why we collect data and that's why we analyze data. That's good.
So
So,
that's the nuance that we're picking up on, and that's why we're looking at more and more intensely this repeat visitation challenge.
Right. Well, I'm going to say, from my perspective, and I'm sure from your perspective too, that's just the tantalizing tip of the data iceberg that people can find out even more through your data stories. So let's finish up by talking about two things. So how
Okay.
can I, as average Joe Blow, independent museum professional, interested museum staff person, how can I access these data stories? Can anybody access these data
Anybody
stories?
can.
Okay.
So
Through
the
your website, I bet.
through my website and through AAM's website, they're available both
So
ways.
we will give links
Yep.
there. And then if I am a museum, like if I'm a museum director or development director or somebody important high up on the food
They're
chain at a
all
museum,
important.
okay, I agree. Um, if I'm the decision maker about that,
Okay.
how do museums become part of your work?
Right. So, the easiest way is to participate in the annual survey of museum goers. We get a few hundred museums every year participating. And it the base fee starts at $1,250. So for $1,250, participating museums receive a link to field their survey with their communications list. And we collect, they field the survey, they send it out. We collect the responses, and then we provide 2 to 3 reports to them. I say 2 to 3 because we just started a new one, and we're pretty sure we're doing 3. So that what starts off is when they get their results back, they get a spreadsheet with all their results on it. So we compare them against what the overall results were. But because we have a few hundred museums participating, we end up doing a lot of what we call data cuts. And so data cuts is where we take the type of museum you are, and sometimes we cross it against the size of your museum, sometimes we don't, and we give you your peer group comparisons. So if you are, let's say, a history museum, you're going to get comparison against other history museums, but then you're also going to get a comparison against other history museums of your budget size, because we
Ah,
almost always have all these budget cuts. But let's say you're a history museum, but you're a military history museum. Well, we typically run a military museum cut. So you can compare yourself against other military museums, because a military museum is going to have a very different audience
right,
than a museum of dolls and toys, which we
right.
get those too. And so you want to have
Well,
that nuance.
or will it? What does the data say? Who knows?
They are different.
Okay.
Um, and so we do these different, and then one of the things like we do for science center,
Spoiler alert. People who go to military museums are not the same audience as those who go to dolls and toys museums.
they
Okay.
are not. So like let's look at science centers. One of the things we do is we run science centers, and we run it by budget cuts for all these different science centers. But one of the questions that we ask and we program into the hidden part of the survey is, do you also have a children's museum in your community?
Ah,
Because science centers where there is no children's museum in the community skew a little bit differently than science centers that have a children's museum in the
yes,
community.
they
So
do.
there's usually that comp group. So you can say, not only this is how we compare against science centers, but oh, let's look at this. We're skewing a little bit younger in terms of the families visiting. Oh, that's because we have no children's museum in our community. Look at this. There's a difference. So we get into
Huh.
these really narrow peer groups that we can do these comparisons with, and we plot all those out on the spreadsheet along with any written comments that that museum receives. So they get this really comprehensive spreadsheet. We do a video about how do you look at your spreadsheet and just walk through. This is how you work with this
Well,
spreadsheet.
that
That's hidden
sounds like
only for
that sounds like a real bargain for museums, and I'll include. I'm sure we can include the link for how people can join up and partner with you and AAM.
and
So
then they also also get a slide deck report so that they can also get a visualization with their data charted. If they're a museum that's participated before, we track their historical data and provide that and chart that out for them. And then we also, last year, for the first time, and we'll probably do it again this year, did a one-page infographic for every museum that they could just slip into
Oh,
a grant. They could give it to their board, just say, this is who our audience is,
here's
and just
what
kind of have that little
is
piece
what
in.
the data tells us about our museum. Man, that's great. Well, and not least of which they get to work with the charming and intelligent Susie Wilkening and her
Actually,
staff.
they work a
So,
lot more with the charming and fabulous Jessica Struby, who runs the survey for us now.
well,
So my hands are all over it too, but she's the one that works directly with the museums, and she's wonderful working with museums directly. People
well,
love her.
super. Well, Susie, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I'm glad you gave us again, the proverbial tip of the data iceberg in your work, but I think we've covered a lot of good ground today, and I'm super happy that we were able to talk.
Me too. It's always good to catch up with you.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.